I am really sorry I can't be there with you this morning again. Again, this is a little bit of a strange setup here, so bear with me. We make things work one way or another. My hope is that by this time in the series of messages that I've been on, that most of my listeners will know that Judah and the southern kingdom, and eventually the nomenclature of Judah, Judahite, Jew, Jewish, is not synonymous with the northern kingdom, which is usually referred to as House of Israel, sometimes Ephraim or Samaria. And I keep repeating this because, especially with what I'm going to present today, which is a little bit unusual, I think most of you will be surprised of where this goes. But I want to make sure that you keep in the back of your mind, because we have this tendency to think, as we're looking at these people who spread out upon the face of the earth, we can easily slip into the trap. These are not Judahites. These are not Jews. The scripture clearly says they will forget. They will not keep the law. They will clearly forget who they are. All that is true. So as I get into my message, I need you to keep thinking this. Otherwise, you're going to have some strange connections in your mind. So let me take a few steps back here. I talked about God's word of promise to Abraham in that one of those earlier messages, and we looked at God's promise to Abraham, descendants, land, even tells Sarai, kings will come out of you. And so if you recall, God sealed these promises with a covenant. Now we first encounter we'll call it the covenant initial. That is where Abraham kills the birds and fire passes through in that. But that is not the actual covenant. That's kind of like God saying, this is my word. But the sign of the covenant was circumcision. And God gave that and said, this is basically a mark, an identification with covenanting with me, if you will. So we have that whole group of promises that were given to Abraham that are passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob. And what sets these people, or what is supposed to set these people apart, is that God made a covenant with them that he didn't make with other nations. So most of the people here, most of you old-timers, will be familiar with the Hebrew word for covenant, berit. And why this is important, because we're going to see this word being used. We know it's used at least 260 times in the Old Testament. It's used more than that, but 260 to denote a covenant. And then you go in and you read where God says an everlasting covenant, an intensifier on the covenant itself. So this word for covenant will surface in many upcoming messages. If you recall the last message I delivered, I spoke about a king Parpetua, who I believe is Barbatua. And if you go to look at his name and highlight the B or P, R, T, you've got those three consonants. Remember that these languages typically don't have vowels in their original format. So we're looking at P or B, R, T, but specifically for the Berit, B, R, T. And that's why I mentioned this Parpetua. His name likely is a derivative of Berit. Obviously, we have a person like Brutus, who will leave Troy, found New Troy, and we know that he will impart his name to not only the land but the people. So Briton, British, and British is Brit, covenant, and ish, the Hebrew word for man, covenant man, British. So we have evidence of these concepts elsewhere. Believe it or not, there is good evidence for the BRT or the PRT on Phoenician coins of all places. They would have a stamping like that, and we know that linguistically this was close enough that the BRT takes you back to the covenant. Now, why am I telling you all this? And this will be a very strange journey I take you on today, no question. In 1804, a strange stone was unearthed in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. It is known as the Newton stone. Now, here's where it gets a little crazy. It's dated to somewhere between 400 BC. Once thought impossible to decipher. They said that about the Rosetta Stone, and you know that Champollion cracked the code and solved it. But here's the problem. It took them, those who uncovered it, and then even to this day, there's a great debate. If you go online and you can look at the stone, the Newton stone, it's there online for you to see. We know that one of the languages is Ogham. There's no question. The other script remain much of a subject of contention, and I say this laughingly because even for myself, I looked at this and I was thinking, well, it has Pictish, it looks Pictish, but beyond that, very, very hard to distinguish, save one symbol in there that is very distinguishable. Now, there was a scholar by the name of Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Waddell, and he hypothesized that the inscription was Phoenician and Ogham. Now, I have to say a little footnote, because some of you will look up things that I say. He was a brilliant thinker. The problem is a lot of his work has been debunked. He had a bent. His bent was on, back in the day when he was writing, to make everything Aryan, white equation, everything, all roads led back to one particular area. So his work was kind of put in the category of on the fringes, if you will. However, what he postulated, his interpretation of the inscription, and I'm going to read to you, it's a little bit choppy, but the sun cross, which, by the way, is a swastika on the stone itself, unless anybody get crazy right now. That symbol has been used historically and going into antiquity for hundreds of thousands of years by different cultures. Native American Indians use that sign as the symbol of the turning earth and the seasons. There are other cultures around the world who have used this symbol. Usually it has to do with the movement of the earth or eternity, the principles of movement, depending on if it was placed to the right, turning to the right, or turning to the left. But this is important because it tells you that this particular symbol that's on this stone wasn't put there at a later date associated with maybe what people might immediately think a swastika, and they think of Nazi Germany. Well, they stole that symbol from the ancients, I hate to tell you. So the sun cross, and the inscription says, the sun cross was raised to Bel, the sun god, by the Cassi clan of the Kalani, which is a Phoenician name, by Icar of Cilicia, the Barat, B-R-T. Now, why this is interesting is because this stone was supposedly erected by one Partalone, again another P-R-T name, and if we're looking at this properly in this timeline, we know that Partaleon would have been a king of the Scots. We know his brother Brennus was involved in the sacking of Rome in 390 BC. So there's good reason to kind of lean to this decipherment, but I'm not so hung up on the whole message as I am. Most scholars agree that the Barat appearing on the inscription is actually what that is saying. So regardless of anything else on there, that's what grabbed my attention. That a stone like that, and which they've uncovered so many different stones with Pictish type, were undecipherable at the time writing. To look at this and see this stone having the three letters Barat, which we just were talking about, covenant. So I'm going to take you from one oddity to another. Bear with me because this one's a roller coaster ride. Big leap away from the BRT of Scotland and England. Let's leap all the way to India. One thing leads to another. So I'm going to guess that most of my listening audience did not know that before India was called India, it was called Bharat. And it is still referred to that in their constitution to this day. You can go and look that up online. And why I think this is interesting is because you're going to start to see repeating patterns of things. And as I said, it may be that these people we are going to encounter, Saka, Scythians, and others, they may have no recollection of their past, but certain things keep popping up to tell you there's a connection. So you're saying, well, you're talking about the lost tribes, the sons of Isaac, or the Beit Humri, or any people you've mentioned, and you're in India? Bear with me. So the great masterwork, the Mahabharata, and I know I'm exaggerating the pronunciation, it may not be pronounced like that, to exaggerate the BRT, and I quote, this is what is from their masterwork. King Bharata gave his name to the dynastic race which he was the head, and that is a quote straight from the Mahabharata. So most people think this work is much older, but in fact it may only date to about 400 BC, with events that are contained in it dating to maybe the 9th or 8th century. Now here's what is important, because a lot of people just dismiss this and say, well, it's a collection of mythological tales. No, not so. The Mahabharata is a collection of history mingled with myth. The story begins with the descendants of King Bharata, and you might be asking, what is the connection back to the lost house of Israel? The Sakas and the Sakasuni people, who we will come to see are also being referred to as Scythian, Saka Scythian, and this will tie into Bharata. Why? Because, as I said, as these people travel, they may have forgotten the law, although I should say this, and you'll hear me repeat this often. It was customary, by the way, with the Scythian people, especially the Saka Scythian people. They did not keep swine. They did not raise pigs. They did not eat pigs. Does that sound familiar? And that could just be one, but there actually are many of these. So we'll come back to that. In the writings called the Puranas, we have a mention of the Madas or Madras from the Saka tribe, sometimes referred to as Sakya, also the Sags, and eventually people called the Sai, S-A-I or S-E-I. The last name will be identified with China, but these are people who started out as deportees and over time will keep traveling, keep moving, whether it is the merger of cultures, whether it is to stay alive and stay away from your enemies, or whether it was encroaching invaders to a new territory, and many of these, of what I just said, take place. So the question might be, how does this all fit in? Well, the first thing I got to tell you is we got to talk about a place called Parthenia. And there's not too much written about Parthenia, but again, PRT could have been BRT, but we know it is PRT. And that name, Parthenia, that country, might ring a bell if you remember on the day of Pentecost when they said, how can these people hear us? Parthians, Medes, Elamites. Parthians, Medes, and Elamites all live in this particular area. I thought it was interesting that the Parthians are mentioned in that as being a body of people present on the day of Pentecost. But this is where it starts to get interesting. Parthenia lay to the north of Persia itself, nestled between Bactria and the southern third of the Caspian Sea. The exact location would correspond to Khorasan, the northeast area of modern-day Iran. According to, we've got multiple sources here, but according to Darius, the inhabitants of this land called Parthava were also Indo-Iranian peoples referred to as Parni. A subgroup of inhabitants lived in these parts too, called the Dehi or the Dahi, appeared to be people living on the eastern flank of the Caspian Sea, living near or amongst the Saka Tigra Kauda people. Of course, these are the same Saka people we've been following. And what is documented is that Parthia was overrun at one point with a diverse people, when in fact it's clear that the Parthians were kinsmen of the Saka, especially when we know that Saka, eventually they found Sakistan or Sakistan, and Sakistana becomes part of the Parthenian Empire. So we might still be thinking, what a strange coupling. These people were deported into a particular area. What a strange blend. So, this is what we know about these people living in that particular area. The famed Professor Rawlinson wrote, "The manners of Parthenians had, much like Scythic in them, their language was half Scythic, half Median. They armed themselves in the Scythic fashion. They were in fact Scyths in descents, in habits, and in character." So that gives you a good idea from a very famed professor. We also know from Diodorus that Parthenians had passed from the dominion of the Assyrians to the Medes and thence to the Persians. So some strange linguistic connections. And don't think I've abandoned India or China. Just bear with me because it takes a while to weave this whole fabric here. So we have the linguistic connection of Aramaic, which we know is very close to Hebrew, and eventually a language that is spoken by the people that we're looking at in Parthenia and these areas called Pahlavi, which means Parthenian is undoubtedly Iranian. However, it's laden with Aramaic and Hebrew words. Now we know after the Assyrian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire would fall to the generals charged with this area after the death of Alexander the Great. So history records that Parthia and Bactria revolted against Greek rule, declaring themselves independent. And all of these little pieces are important. If you remember, Alexander the Great conquered the then known world as far as the Indus Valley. So it won't be foreign for us to start thinking of how these people began to stretch out and migrate and the movement. But we know the first rulers of this independence is a person named Arsaces or Arsaxes. And if you look carefully at his name, you see the Saka in there, who is Bactrian, but Scythian for sure. I have here another quote from Rawlinson, who said, "There seems to be no doubt that the population of Bactria was largely Scythian." So how does all this tie into India? And there's not enough time for me here to get into the details, because this is more of a general presentation. We can always circle back and look into each category. But what I want to point to is maybe the connection between Iran and Persia and India. But first, let me explain a little bit about another misnomer, if you will. I believe in the last message I referenced Aryan Indo-Europeans. And let's talk about this term Aryan for a second. So Aryan, according to Britannica Online, was the name given to a people who spoke an archaic Indo-European language and were thought to have settled in prehistoric Iran and then into India. Britannica Online. What is remarkable, according to, and I hope I say this right, it was in a discourse given by Sri Ramakrishna in Pasadena in 1990. He said the Aryans came to India in small companies. Gradually, these tribes began to expand and for a time became the undisputed rulers of India. So Aryan means distinguished or noble, character, and we can trace the Persian word, so our English word Aryan, we trace it to Aran, E-R-A-N, that will become known in modern times as Iran, or think about Tehran. They all have that Iran in them. Let me ask you if you think this is a coincidence, and I need to put a little footnote right here. I don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting that the people who inhabit modern-day Iran or Tehran are descendants of the people we're talking about. But I would like you to take a look at something. If you want to open your Bibles to Numbers 26, beginning verses 35 and 36. So Numbers 26, and this is what it says. These are the descendants of Ephraim by their clans through Shuthelah, the Shulathite clan, through Becher, the Becherite clan, through Tahan, the Tanite clan, and these were the descendants of Shethelah through Aaron, the Aaronite clan. I don't know if that is just an anomaly, because that's the same spelling, E-R-A-N, as the word where we get the word Iran. Now, whether that is or isn't, don't look at me. But what I want to start connecting the dots here. So we know that the Assyrians, over several different deportations, and I say several, we know that one area in particular, these people were brought to the cities of the Medes. So there's good reason to believe that this information has a number of connections to groups with Parthia. Not implausible to assume that the Tahanites are none other than a group referred to as the Dehe or the Dehites. I'll elaborate on this because a lot of times the letters get switched, scribal mistakes or pronunciation. So I need to come back to talk about these people, whether it's in this message or not. But the question still remains, if the Indo-Aryan people migrated into India, perhaps by way of the Kush Mountains, which is modern-day Pakistan, what, if any, are the connections to the Saka people, the sons of Isaac, and what other connections can we make? So let me stop right there by saying we can trace the Aryan, Indo-European people coming into that area. And whether these were already mingled with Saka, whether they were purely Aryan, that's a question that remains to be answered. However, you start looking at culturally what these people may have brought with them from Persia, from Iran, into northern India. We know Zoroastrianism, for example, originated in Persia but was brought to northern India. Zoroastrianism was the official state religion during the Achaemenid time. Then during Cyrus the Great into the Parthian Empire, Zoroastrianism ceased to be a state religion, particularly of Iran, after the Arab conquest and the widespread mandate for people to convert to Islam that started in 760s AD. So what this tells me, though, is if you start looking at cultural connections, we can say that we know Hinduism was already in the land, but concepts of Zoroastrianism begin to get grafted, and we'll see kind of a merging of sorts of a diversity of different personages, which we could definitely say happens in any culture when people are merging their culture, their language, their ways of life. So, again, I'm going to repeat, I urge caution. Do not think that I am saying that all these people were lost tribes, specifically people living in Iran, that all these, no, they weren't. We're talking about people that were brought there as part of the deportation, the Assyrian deportation of the northern house of Israel. And I make these connections because I think they are critical. It's impossible to see all these people and not recognize a common thread. Now, I'm going to read you something off of a website called indianculture.gov.in, and you tell me what you think. The Jats, who, by the way, if we were talking to people who claim to be Jats or descendants of Jats in modern times, they would coil back at this because they are typically Muslim. But the Jats, and it looks like Medes, dwelt in Sind over the river which is called Bahar. These two tribes fought with each other often. These Jats are none other than the Massagete, mentioned by Diodorus as an offspring of the ancient Saka tribe. This is off of indianculture.gov.in. The Jats and the Sakas belong to the same Caspian type, as is well known. So, and that is from a completely far remove. This isn't like we're trying to make a point so we force an issue here. None of that. So the Sakas, therefore, have been known in Indian history from at least the period of the Mahabharata War. And the Mahabharata states the Caspian Sea was encircled by parts of the Saka. So We can't be quick to discount any of this information. And in fact, I find it fascinating because we will see they're mentioned a lot in Indian culture. The Purana also adds that the Sakadvipa, or the Saka Scythians, touched the Dehe of the Greeks and that of Media. But here's the strangest part. This is again off of that website, indianculture.gov.in. It says, and it was a little bit hard to read, but it says the Mahabharata says that the Magras, which are the Sakas, were Brahmanas, and that the Masakas, or the Masagete, were the, I have to pronounce this right, the Kastriyas, or the warriors. We actually can get pieces of information adding color, not just from archaeological sites and from things that we have pieced together from antiquity and historians, but you're getting something from an Indian perspective, and this is quite remarkable. In due time, we know that hordes of Saka people came to these regions, and the whole region was once called Sindhu Saka. So a Saka Empire in the Indus country and even beyond is known from classical and modern sources. An excellent source, by the way, one of many sources. This is an Imperial History of India by K.P. Jawasal, who was, I think this is probably a reprint of a book that's in the public domain. He was an attorney and an author and has put together and included pieces of information that many times are omitted. You will see if you go and search what I'm looking at right now, a lot of this is very controversial, especially Indian history. It's very, very hard to find history, truth, and real facts because there's a lot of mingled, conflated, and mythology that's just been grafted in, almost as if like a distraction to not actually find the truth. So we have the Puranas. It's another writing, holy or sacred writing, speaking of the Saka kings, Saha Nahui, being translated King of Kings, existed in the area before the Vikram era. So these are all kind of very interesting things. It appears as though these Saka people settled in Western India, and there founded a kingdom of their own. And after about a rule of 3 centuries or so, they were subdued by the Guptas, and in the course of time, many more centuries, they were absorbed by the Hindus. There, as I said, are some remarkable pieces of history to put together. But one of these, it's called the Ramayana of the Valmiki, has many references to the Saka. In it, there are accounts of struggles between ancient Aryans of India and the mixed hordes of Yavanas, Greeks, and Sakas. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And from their records, and this is why I said we can't just turn a blind eye. Wherever we find these source materials, we have to pursue them. So the Sakas, along with the Yavanas, or the Greeks, and the Pallavas, distinguished by the Parthians, are mentioned in something also called, I hope I say this right, Bigru Samhita. And this is published by the Vedic Research Institute. I always try to give credit when I can. So what we are seeing, if you would look at a map and watch how these people move, they didn't just go into India and thence on into China. We're going to encounter these people in a lot of places. What we have not yet itemized is, we're saying Saka, sons of Isaac, but to determine where or which tribe these people might have been from the northern part. And I think we might be able to start micro-examining that. But here's something that will be extremely controversial, I'm sure. No one wants to hear this. But this ties into this very same subject of, you'd be surprised at where you find things, and what you uncover sometimes can change your perception of everything. So there was an article that appeared in 2014. I believe it was labeled a UNESCO site that was being dug up in the border town of Nepal, northeast India, an ancient town called Lumbini. This temple that they have been digging at, they've actually, to my knowledge, and it may be more, there have been at least 5 digs that I know of, 2 in the temple and then exterior digs around the area. But from the Maya Devi temple, which is the reputed birthplace of Gautama Buddha. So why is this so interesting? Because this opens up a whole can of worms. And as I said, sometimes we're not prepared for what we find, but I'm reporting it to you anyways because it's kind of mind-boggling to me too. So in this archaeological dig that is being conducted by, I believe, Durham University, well, at the time it was Durham University in conjunction with UNESCO and one other group. So we're talking about legitimate people who are digging with experience. They begin digging down and they see that the location was used as far back as 1300 BC. Now that's a revelation because if we put Buddha's birth somewhere, it is ambiguous. No one has exactly crystallized the date, whether his date happens in the 500s or in the 600s. I'm not here to debate that. But we're talking about 1300 BC. This goes well before the date of Buddha's birth. So from this dig, though, we learn that Buddha's father, Suddhodana, which I think is interesting, Buddha's father, wait for it, was the ruler of the Saka, or at this time people called the Shakya people. So the child, before being known to the world as Gautama Buddha, was known as Saka Mundi. Now, I know that sounds absolutely crazy, and people might say, the first place your mind goes is lost tribe, but I want you to think of how much time has passed by the time we get to Buddha, whether we put Buddha's birth in the 600s or 500s BC would be irrelevant. There's still enough time that has passed for these people to have moved, migrated, taken on cultures, ways of life, changed, intermarried, had children. And so you can get the idea we would no longer be looking at a people that we could clearly identify. Equally, what is important is this will strike people as kind of a little bit crazy. But if you look to earlier artwork, earlier Indian artwork, and some of the earlier northern, specifically northern Indian artwork, you will see that a lot of the people depicted in artwork, they do not look necessarily Caucasian, nor do they look dark-skinned or Indian. So that's something for you to think about. But we know, for example, that his mother's name was Maya, Buddha's mother's name was Maya, and that this site was a revered Buddhist place of worship until the 15th century when, for some unknown reason, the pilgrimages quit and the site was lost. And this is kind of interesting. I'm curious to know if this was being kept a secret, if people knew about it. And like I said, there's nothing I'm saying here that you can't go out and research for yourself. It just becomes very clear that we're talking about subgroups of people who migrated, and we're not talking about the full concentration of the sons of Isaac starting off, for example, when they first are deported and placed into those buffer zones. So that is pretty important to keep in mind. We also know there's another ruler who may be one of the more famed rulers, Ashoka, who was also part of the Saka dynasty. Now, let me stop here and say some strange words, and these are just things that one has to think about in terms of parallels. Because if you remember, there would be no Buddhism until Buddha is enlightened. Up until a certain point, he's just a prince, gets married, has a child, and he's not considered at that particular point in his life anything more or less than any other child, except that he was a prince. So, it struck me that when I was thinking, reading, and studying for this, it dawned on me, okay, so here's this prince who is separated from the world, living in a palatial riches, and then goes out into the world as a young man who has everything and gives up everything that he has to help as he identifies and sees the people with sickness, death, and so forth. He's transformed to no longer desire the ways that he had been accustomed to. And I am not saying that there are great parallels, but I do see some parallels, for example, with Moses, who grew up in the palaces of Egypt, wanting nothing, having everything at his disposal, and then one day, obviously being identified with his brethren and his kin, forsaking the life and the riches. And I'm not saying that these are parallel universes. I'm just saying somehow there is some common thread there. Now, the Buddhist people probably will not like what I'm saying, but it's very clear that the Saka line includes the birth of Buddha. What you do with that, that's your business. If you're interested, the history according to and I hope I say this right, the Hanshu covering the period of 200 BC to 25 AD, records the following. When formerly the Zhenu conquered the Yuzi, the latter moved west and established themselves as masters of the Diajia. I probably didn't say that right. It was under these circumstances that the kingdom of Sei, S-A-I, Saka, moved south and established himself as master of Jibin. So we can see the tendency here of these people to keep moving and to keep establishing and building kingdoms. And again, I make certain connections. We were told through the words given to Sarai that she would bear kings. Now, my mind first goes to the line of Judah, where the true kings would come from, ultimately to the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, that whole line. But let's not forget the fact that through all of these times, we're going to encounter people who become kings, who will rule in a diversity of places. And as I said, this is a tremendous amount of information, and I'm sure much of it will be looked at with a controversial eye, but I urge you, whether you have access to books like this or simply the website that I mentioned earlier, there is a plethora of resources to investigate this particular branch that we've looked at. And of course, there's much more detailed history. I'm just trying to give you an overview to kind of make clear that these people, they may have started in the northern kingdom of Israel, but obviously we see them being placed into those buffer zones and then dispersed. Some of them will stay embedded within the Russian steppes and actually move more inward. Some will move north, some will go around, some will go south. It's very interesting to see the patterns of migration, which over the coming weeks I hope we can trace out. But I want to kind of repeat something that I think is the common thread in all of these messages, which is the promise given to Abraham of seed, in thy seed. And I highlighted in that, I believe, one of the first messages, seed singular pointing to Christ, but equally collective seed as in what has been spread over the earth. And we've only looked at one group that is bifurcated, or actually it's one group with many subcategories in it, the Saka Scythians, which become and there are all these different, you can now see what Saka people, Shakya people in India that become the Sei people of China. And we will encounter more Saka Scythians going in another direction. But the important thing to remember here is that I'm not presenting something for just the sake of an oddity, but to show you that God, when he gave that promise of seed and said to Abraham, as stars of the sky, of sand, of the sea. That's what your people will be like. You begin to see the trace patterns of these people upon the face of the earth, and you recognize that God indeed made good on his promise. And if you can take God at his word through what he's already made good through this word, how much more to what has not yet been fulfilled in Scripture, and how much more simply trusting him to stand by his word, as that's what he has demonstrated in these messages. There's so much here and so much we need to, in detail, look into, but at least today you have the broad picture of this particular area we're looking at, which are the people traveling into an influx into India and China and other parts, as we will see. Now, there'll be one more question. People will say, well, these people eventually don't look like, and fill in the blanks. As I said, a careful investigation will show you that these are not one singular people, and that over the course of time, these will intermarry, and of course that will be the product of with each generation morphing and taking on the characteristics of each respective group. So the only way we know how to identify and get clarity that way is through DNA. I leave you with this last thought. There was a massive DNA study done in India, and it was to try and ascertain where the bulk of the people from different regions came from. The report itself was suppressed. This will surprise you, shocker, was suppressed by their media. They did not want it to get out. You can find this story online as well as many of the other things I've referenced. But the interesting thing was definitely that we could see evidence of multiple haplogroups, that is, multiple groups, subcategories, but distinguished, separate entities that flooded into the country, as well as those people that purportedly were there originally. I'm not really quite sure who we could say was at any place originally, but the study just is a little bit mind-boggling. So I hope you will be here next week. We'll pick up on the same subject, and we're looking at God's control in history and through his word of promise, him making good. That's the God we serve, and that's my message.
I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.